Hey guys, I'm back with the final round of the World Open. So going into this round, I had 5.5 points out of 8, which is definitely a pretty reasonable score, especially for someone of my rating. I was certainly in contention for the under 2450 prize, and my opponent for this round was Grandmaster Ehsan Ghaem Maghami, who is a pretty strong player. I think he's been much higher rated than 2544. So I definitely felt like this was, again, going to be a tough game with black against a GM. And given the tournament situation and how I was kind of in contention for a prize, I was certainly, obviously, very interested in trying to win the game, but I also felt like a draw would be a really satisfactory result. So my main intention for this game was to just try to play as solid as possible and not to get into any situations where my position is extremely dangerous and I have to do a lot of calculation to make it work, but rather keep things under control. Okay, that's not always so easy to do when you're playing the King's Indian, but that was kind of the idea. He started with c4, I played g6, d4, and now I just went back to knight f6. It seems like he was totally fine with playing a King's Indian, and I was as well. So bishop g7, g3, castles, bishop g2, and we essentially get the main line of the fianchetto system. I play this move knight c6, castles. This is kind of the main position where black has a lot of options here, bishop f5, a6. Black also has a lot of options that don't include putting the knight on c6, but rather playing knight bd7 or even c5. But here I decided to go for e5, which is one of the more trendier moves in this position in the last couple of years, and something that I've played a couple of times now, so I was certainly not too unhappy to get this over the board again. He decided to take on e5. This is considered one of two big main lines. The other big option is for white to push forward with d5 and close the position, and follow up with a quick e4, and we'll get this typical close structure. But he goes for d takes e5, keeping the position kind of more open. I play de, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and bishop g5. So this is a little bit surprising, mainly because it's kind of considered more critical for white to play bishop g5 in this position, so not initiating the queen trade. Then if black trades queens, then white gets the rook to d1 with tempo, so it's kind of a better version for white. Black usually goes bishop e6 here. And then the line gets very theoretical. Both queen c1 and queen a4 are considered the main tries for white, and there's certainly a lot of theory here. The position, I think, is very complicated. It's probably not something a strong player would want to go into if they weren't super well prepared. So I have a feeling my opponent just wanted to, let's say, play the position, not get involved in some kind of theoretical dispute, and he decides just to trade the queens and go bishop g5, kind of typical exchange fashion. But here I think there's a little bit more strategic danger for black compared to like the regular exchange variation in the King's Indian, because in that variation the pawn is already on e4. Here white's pawn is still on e2, and I think that's a big advantage for white because it means that in the future white can always fight for the d4 square by putting the pawn on e3 and not allowing black to establish a strong knight on d4, as black often likes to do in the exchange variation when both of white's pawns are already committed to e4 and c4. So strategically, I think this is a much healthier version for white, but objectively, I think black should also be totally fine here. I play bishop e6. This is the main move. White played knight d2, and now h6. And white doesn't really have much of a choice here because I believe bishop e3 just kind of runs into knight g4, and this is extremely awkward to meet because the knight on d2 is potentially hanging. So white kind of has to take on f6 here, and I recaptured. Black could also take on d2, but I don't think it's as clear after bishop takes g7, king takes g7. For example, bishop c6, bc6, and b3. I kind of feel like this position's a little bit easier for white to play. The Stockfish will tell you that it's equal, but with the double pawns and knight versus bishop, it always feels like there's some strategic danger here, and black might not have enough activity with this one rook on the second rank to fully compensate for the weakness of these pawns. I think that position is probably playable, but in any case, I think it's just much easier for black just to simply recapture on f6 and not go for this line with rook takes d2. Now if white takes on c6 here, I think there's a pretty significant difference in that black has 2 bishops versus 2 knights, which is, I think, much stronger than 1 bishop versus 1 knight. And here I think the 2 bishops fully compensate black for the weakness of the queen side here, because I think the 2 bishops are really strong. The knights are going to have a hard time being able to really do anything as long as I keep the c5 square under control. And once black goes f5 and e4, I think black is at least not worse here. I would say extremely comfortable, maybe even better. So I definitely wasn't worried about that. A typical move white often can play is knight d5. This is kind of the extent of my preparation for this position. I knew that against knight d5, black should take on d5. Bishop takes d5 I think is not so good because of knight b4. And again, the knight on d2 is hanging, and this is probably not good for white. After c takes d5, which I think is the better move, black can go knight b4. White has to go e4 to defend the pawn, and then after c6, black is basically equalizing. Either white has to allow us to take this pawn, or white has to take on c6, and... oh, sorry, I don't think this is really working because of rook takes d2. So basically, I think white probably has some way to equalize here. Maybe a3 or something, but black is also fine. Can always play like knight c2, knight d4, and black should have no problems in this position. Okay, so instead my opponent played rook fd1, which I think is maybe the best move that keeps more tension in the position. Objectively, I don't think white has much in this endgame, especially after giving up the bishop. But there is some problems white can still pose here. So for example, actually in this position I decided to spend a lot of time because this was maybe my first move out of prep after rook fd1. I definitely didn't know for sure what the best move here was for black. But I realized, white still is playing for the advantage here because he wants to play knight to d5. And now with the rook on d1, it's going to be a lot easier for white to support the pawn. So after bishop takes, c takes, for example, if I go knight b4, white will have moves like knight c4, and the pawn on d5 will be nicely protected. So for example, had I played, let's say, bishop g7, which I think is a normal move, bishop e7 is what I ended up playing. Here after knight d5, if I take c takes and then go knight b4, then after knight c4, I think white is just going to have at least a small advantage here. Because the pawn on d5 is well defended, white can still put this pawn on e3 so as not to block the bishop, and eventually this rook can come to c1. And white will always have this pressure along the c-file that will be somewhat nagging. So a position like this where black isn't able to get c6 in, because I think c6 in these positions is probably just going to be met with d6 very soon, and then maybe knight takes c5. So if I'm not able to make this break with c6, then it could just be leading to a really passive situation for black. Okay, so yeah, I will explain why I ended up playing bishop e7. I felt like after knight d5 and rook ac8 that I just didn't see a good way for white to continue to pose problems here, and I think this was a really accurate way to kind of equalize the situation for black. Also good was the move bishop g7 with the same idea. If white goes knight d5, black just calmly goes rook ac8, and there's no good way for white to follow up here. And now black wants to play maybe b6 at some point, and then f5 and e4. b6 is particularly useful if white threatens to come to c5, like knight b3 for example, or knight e4. These moves could be met with b6, where white wouldn't really have any good discovery against the knight on c6. And if black is able to just expand f5 e4, then the dark square bishop one day will become an extremely strong piece, because especially since this bishop is unopposed. So this is certainly, I think, a very reasonable continuation, maybe even more ambitious than what happened in the game, and something to try for next time. But okay, I thought bishop e7 was very logical because I wanted to keep the c5 square under control so that I can meet any move like knight e4 with f5, and that wouldn't really make sense for white. And now white has to be careful not to fall worse here, because again, if he allows f5 e4, then his bishop is going to be kind of shut out of the game, and black might just take over the initiative. So he ends up going knight d5. I played rook ac8, and here he decided to trade on e7, kind of bailing out and avoiding a worse position, which I think was actually the correct decision. For instance, had he played a move like knight e4 here, which does look very natural to a lot of English players, just putting all of the knights, on these center squares. Then after black goes bishop f8, white no longer can trade off the bishop, and now I'm threatening to play f5 and again make this kingside expansion. The knight cannot jump to c5, and any kind of check on f6 is just going to be really short-lived, and the knights here I think are just really unstable, and I think white is going to be much worse here very soon. For instance, black has ideas of moving the knight to d4 and then pushing c6, and it's going to be very difficult for white to maintain both knights there. So I think for this reason he decided to take on e7, and I think that this was probably the correct decision to make sure he doesn't fall worse here. I play knight takes e7. Now if bishop takes b7, of course this is no problem for black, just rook b8, and then I'll go rook takes b2 next. So instead white played b3, so defending the pawn in advance. I played b6, and now f4. So yeah, to me it definitely felt like my opponent was still trying to create some winning chances, even though objectively he probably understood just fine that the position is close to equal. And I think this is an interesting try. At least it's kind of changing up the pawn structure. It's forcing black to make a decision. Objectively, the move still doesn't lead to white's advantage, but black still has to continue to play well to kind of prove that. I decided to take on f4. I felt like this was the simplest thing. G takes f4, and now I played the move rook d4. And this was kind of based on a concrete calculation, because I'm hitting the pawn and kind of inducing the move e3. But then I get to play rook d3 also with tempo. So the point is that I'm attacking the pawn, and if he makes the wrong move defending it, I might just double up on the d-file and immediately cause a lot of pressure. So for example, king f2 here I think would be a really bad move after rook d8. It's very hard for white to actually keep everything defended. King e1, for example, loses the e3 pawn, king e2. During the game, I thought maybe bishop g4 check would be annoying here, and I think it is, but even better is just the move knight f5, where we're attacking the e3 pawn again, and knight f1 runs into this nice trick, knight g3 check, followed by bishop g4 check, and black is going to be winning the exchange. So, yeah, because of this idea with rook cd8, white has to basically immediately play knight f1 and challenge for the d-file. But now I just played rook d8, I double up, and I'm forcing white to trade. Rook takes d3, rook takes d3. White played king f2. Now I feel like with my rook controlling the only open file, I mean, if anyone is better, maybe black is slightly better. During the game, I wasn't really entertaining too many ambitions, because I first and foremost just wanted to make sure I keep everything under control and keep things solid. If my opponent was to start taking a lot of risk and going crazy, playing for the win, then of course I would pick up the gauntlet and just try to win the game myself. Like if he starts pushing too many pawns too quickly, then yeah, I mean I would try to punish him for that. But he starts playing pretty solidly here. First I decided to retreat rook d8. The point here is that now if white plays king e2, it's not with tempo, and I can play something like bishop g4 check, which is kind of annoying. He decided to go rook e1. I played a5. I think just a useful move. Maybe I'll play a4 at some point and start putting some pressure against white's queenside. Rook e2. So here I understood that his idea was to play rook d2 and trade off a pair of rooks. And yeah, with the rooks being traded, the position just becomes extremely drawish, because it's very difficult for either side to create chances here. And at this point, I don't think I can really justify playing for the win, because, well, if I avoid the rook trade, then I'll be giving up the only open file, and that's usually not a good way to to keep the game going, but rather it's a way to fight for a worse position, if anything. So okay, I just decided just to keep it solid. f6, rook d2. We traded. I played king f7, knight e4, a4. G5 was also perfectly possible here, nothing wrong with this move at all, but I thought a4 made sense just to immediately put some pressure and leave white with a potentially weak pawn on b3. So he played knight c3, a takes b3, a takes b3. Now white does have at least a couple of ideas of how he could try to pose some problems in this type of position. His initial threat, I believe, is to play the move knight to b5 and hit the c7 pawn, and if black moves the pawn either c6 or c5, well then the b6 pawn becomes kind of a bigger target, and maybe the knight can jump back to c3, maybe head to a4 at some point, and try to target this weakness in the future. I mean, objectively, black should have a way of dealing with this and should be fine, but okay, some questions to be answered still. I came up with I think a pretty reasonable move here, king e8, and my idea behind this move was simply to meet knight b5 with king d7, just defending the pawn. But more importantly, I wanted my king to be somewhat in the center, so that if white is not careful, my king can one day threaten to infiltrate on the queen side and even head for this b3 pawn. So it's a move that kind of signifies that black is not only willing to defend, but also interested in playing for the initiative as well. And if white is not careful, then he might get into trouble one day with the king kind of heading towards the queen side. Okay, so here my opponent actually offered me a draw, which was a little bit weird since he didn't even make it with a move, as you're typically supposed to do. I guess he felt like, the position is super equal and there's very little chance that I'm going to be playing for a win here, as black is certainly not really better anymore. So I guess he felt like he can literally make any move in the position, or almost any move that doesn't hang something, and the position would still be equal. So I thought for a second, I thought about asking him to make his move, then I decided just to agree with the draw because, okay, he can make any move, king e2, knight e4, and yeah, I'm not exactly going to be able to play this position for a win, so what's the point? So yeah, that basically finished up my tournament. I finished with a score of 6 out of 9. Eventually this was good enough to tie for second and third place in the under 2450, and I ended up winning a little bit of money, something like $400. I mean, it feels like a lot, but the prizes at the World Open are really big, but I think it was something like 8 or 9 players that I shared with, so we each ended up taking just a little chunk home. Overall, I was definitely happier with this tournament than I was my previous one. My performance rating in this event was certainly better than what I had done in Minnesota. I think some of the games were of pretty good quality too. There are definitely a lot of room for improvements, a lot of miscalculations and small misses, and definitely points where I felt like I could have played a lot sharper, a lot more accurate, a lot more precise. But chess is a tough game. You miss 1 or 2 moves and it can make the difference between a good tournament and a bad tournament in many cases, and it can be tough to deal with. But yeah, that about wraps it up for this series. Thanks to all who have been watching these latest videos and commenting. I really appreciate all the support and feedback. At this point, I'm going to be continuing to make videos for YouTube, so if you have any specific suggestions for what you would like to see, then let me know in the comments, and I'll take everything to heart. Okay, until next time, take care.